Republicans are working hard on the big, beautiful bill. The Trump bill would extend the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act through 2034. That's kind of the big piece here is these tax cuts. And there's a bunch of campaign stuff like no taxes on tips or overtime, things that Trump promised. And the Tax Foundation, this is a nonprofit that analyzes tax policy, estimates the tax cuts would reduce revenues by $4.1 trillion over 10 years. That's $400 billion a year. And the bill also aims to cut $1.5 trillion in spend over the next decade. Some Republicans think this is weak and are pushing for $2 trillion in cuts or more. Friedberg, you actually, I understand from our group chat, did a deep dive here. And you, I think, are responsible in many ways for bringing the issue of our national debt to the forefront, particularly with this administration and DOGE, which we give you a lot of credit for. You being a single issue voter for this, are you worried about the budget now? We're 100 plus days into Trump. Do you think he's got any chance of cutting the deficit?
I'll talk about the House tax bill, which I think is, to use your term, JCal, absolute disgraziad.
Oh,
The bill is disgraziad? Oh, shit.
The bill is a disgraziad.
Oh, wow. It is absolute disgraziad. If you're an American, you should feel shame that your elected officials are proposing that this is the bill that gets passed, that we vaporize this much money, that we put ourselves this much further in debt, that we do not treat the situation as the fiscal emergency that it is. The bill ultimately yields no real change in the annual deficit. The annual deficit could climb to $2.5 trillion being added to the federal debt load every single year going forward. In fact, if you look at the Treasury yields, the 30-year is now kissing 5%. So the United States has called $37 trillion of debt. At 5%, we're paying close to $2 trillion a year just in interest on our debt as this debt gets refinanced. The interest rates are going up because the probability that the U.S. will default on its debt payments, which is what you're buying when you buy U.S. treasuries, you're getting the U.S. government to pay you some number of dollars with interest over time. And the market is now demanding that that interest rate be as high as 5% because of this fiscal situation that the United States finds itself in. We are now burning an additional $2.5 trillion a year, adding to our debt load. We are in a fiscal crisis, and we're not willing to admit it. And I've said this from day one, that DOGE can only do so much. And clearly that's the case where they're now talking about sub $300 billion a year in potential annual savings from DOGE action. At the end of the day, Congress needs to take action. And this bill from Congress doesn't take much action. I will tell you that if you look across the board, all of these programs are still being proposed to be run at a cost that is well in excess of their pre-COVID levels. And so I would set two guiding principles. If I was to be the benevolent dictator of the United States of America, my guiding principle number one would be that any program that we intend to continue to persist have its budget level cut to pre-COVID, to 2019 levels. Second would be, and if we did that, by the way, we would be in a much better fiscal situation. The second would be that we add no new programs in the moment. There's a whole bunch of new shit thrown into this bill, as well as increasing the cost and a few cuts here and there. I'll just highlight a couple that I think are worth noting. You know, there's a cut in the SNAP program, which is the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. That's food stamps. And I talked about this with Brooke Rollins in the interview I did a few weeks ago. You can watch it on YouTube. And we talked a little bit about how this SNAP program has absolutely exploded in size from $60 billion a year in 2019 to $120 billion a year today. So in this budget proposal, they're actually cutting it back by about $30 billion, so to $90 billion. So it's still 50% higher than it was pre-COVID. And there's a lot of kind of stories we could go through on what happened during COVID that caused this thing to blow up the way it did. But political wrangling pulled money out of the government into people's pockets, and that is persisting today. I'm a big believer in cutting taxes. Obviously, I'm probably more libertarian than anyone else on this show or that we've ever had on this show. But at the end of the day, you can't just say, hey, let's cut taxes and spend more than we're making. It doesn't make sense. A lot of the stuff's going to be exploitable. The tips and overtime exclusions are a way to pander to people to get votes and now keeping your promises on those votes. I think at the end of the day, the tips and overtime rule could invite a lot of gamesmanship and loopholes that will be created, and people will wake up and be like, uh-oh. For example, if I'm an independent contractor, I will enter into a contract with someone that says, here's the service I'm providing you for $50. And then there's an optional tip you can give me at the end. And then I won't pay taxes on that tip. And I can give you 100 other examples that this will create an inordinate number of crazy, insane loopholes. The interest on the debt at $1.9 trillion a year equates to 7% of GDP. That means 7 cents of every dollar that moves in every transaction in this country is being used to pay down interest on money we overspent in the past. It has become an absolute crisis. I think that there's a few folks that should be shout out on this, which is Senator Paul and Senator Ron Johnson, who both highlighted how ridiculously underimpressive the spending cuts are in this bill. I think we've got a lot of work to do. I'm deeply disappointed. I'm scared. And I hope that that this all gets kind of fixed up in reconciliation.
Do you think that we should line item out all the new spending, irrespective of what it is?
All new spending, line itemed out. That's rule one. And rule two is all existing programs got to go back to pre-COVID levels. You do those two things, we're in a great place.
Yeah, and just to put some numbers and some charts behind it, here is the debt back to Clinton era. Clinton added $392 billion in 8 years. It's barely noticeable on the chart, 40-50 billion a year. Bush, $5.4 trillion 4 years, about $1.3 trillion a year. Obama, $1 trillion a year. And then we get to Trump 1.0, $2 trillion a year. Suddenly we decided we would double it. Biden, same thing. They added almost exactly the same amount to trillion
the right
a
way
year.
The right way
Trump
to think about this, Jay
is on track to do the same.
Yeah, it's not total dollar amount, it's percent of GDP that you're adding. And, right now at $2.5 trillion a year of deficit, we're talking about a deficit to GDP of like 8%.
Yes.
8% a year. This is like Argentina. This is like insane. The fact that we don't treat this like a fiscal emergency and everyone goes up and they tout, oh, we're going to make $60 billion in cuts in Medicaid. That's out of $820 billion of annual spend. We're making $30 billion in cuts in SNAP. That's still 50% higher spend in total than we were in 2019, a few years ago, when we didn't have that much of a problem. This has become like such a reset of expectations. And I worry again that we went into this, I think, in a very optimistic way, thinking that this administration was going to treat things differently. We had DOGE, we had alignment on the importance of the budget. Besson has highlighted it. And then it's kind of back to gamesmanship in DC. All these representatives from Congress show up and try and get money for their constituents in a way that is not sustainable. We're not going to be able to keep this up, and we're not really having the hard and tough conversations we need to be having. And every year, everyone wants to get elected by keeping programs and keeping money flowing that their constituents elected them to do. And they want to add new programs so they can go on CNBC and say, look at this cool new program I stood up. It's great. This is going to create the future of America. And meanwhile, there's no future of America because we're burning $2.5 trillion a year. It is like an existential crisis that no one's willing to stand up and highlight just how critical this emergency is. $2.5 trillion of deficit spending on a $28 trillion GDP. Tell me when in history that's actually worked out at the end of the day, except when you're in some war and you're going to end up taking over some country and getting all their resources.
And as you mentioned, this has knock-on effects with regard to things like de-dollarization. Why are you investing in the American dollar if you believe
That's
that
why
the dollar
Treasury
is going
yields,
to...
This is the debt death spiral that we find ourselves in, because what happens is people stop owning treasuries when they start to question whether or not 30 years from now, the US government is going to meet its debt obligations. Even the smallest marginal question of that drives interest rates up 1%, 2%. Suddenly, your 30-year treasury yields at 6%, 7%. And then your interest rates climb, and then your deficit spending climbs, and that's how it becomes a spiral. So now the debt goes up even more than it did the year before. And then the next year, it goes up even more per year than it did the year before. That's why it's called a debt death spiral. One of the things I've heard in a lot of members of cabinet that I've met with over the last couple of months is we've got all these new sources of revenue. I had an interview with Doug Burgum. He talked about unlocking America's assets. We've got this balance sheet with lots of assets. We're going to do land leases and all sorts of other things. We met with Lutnick. He's going to sell the Trump gold card, the immigration card. We met with Besant. He's got these ideas on how we're going to drive. Everyone's got great theory on how we're going to grow GDP and actually grow government revenue. But until those dollars start to flow in, we have to get our fiscal house in order. We have to cut spending. When those dollars start to flow in, then you can start to spend. But you can't spend ahead, because otherwise the cost of the debt and the economics uncertainty is going to limit our ability to execute on the back end on that revenue generation. And I'm very worried about no one kind of paying enough attention to this. So I just, I feel very passionate having seen this bill that we're just not on the right track. It's really frustrating.